Hello guys, Craig from fixitfallows, and as you can see I am inside the house today, not in the garage. But why am I in the house? Well, I'm back with my front door. I've done a previous video where I've given this Yao night latch a service. Well, today I'm having to work on the Deadlock down here, which is, as I believe, a 5-lever mortise lock. It's getting very stiff, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to whip that lock out the door, open it up and see if I can't give it a bit of a revival. So here, before I take the lock out, you can see how stiff it is. So I'll turn the key and yeah, just that last bit, it's really difficult to get round. Okay. Okay, so just get that lock out of there. I've got the lock element sticking out. Just get a pair of mole grips on there. Give it a jiggle. And there it goes, it's out. Okay, so here we are. We've got the lock here on the table. It's quite a weighty unit. There's no specific branding on it. I think it's quite old. Going by the gauge of some of the metal and the weight. So what we got? So the actual locking element there, the brass section there. You can see there's some wear there. That looks like that's actually rubbing on the latch bit in the door frame. So we may have to adjust the bit in the door frame a bit. You can see there's some heavy wear there from the actual body faceplate of the lock, and some also there on the underside. So we'll probably give this element here a light rub with some very fine sandpaper, wet and dry possibly, just to take any dirt deposits on there off. Other than that, we'll undo these 4 screws, lift this plate off carefully and see what we have inside. Okay, so there's the back plate. There's a fair bit of wear on that back plate there, so that must be something here rubbing on that. We'll have a look. And there we are. So we'll do a careful inspection before we start taking anything out. Okay guys, so here we are. If we look closely, you can see there is quite a lot of dirt and debris in there, and there doesn't appear to be much in the way of usable grease lubrication in there. What there is very limited, and it looks a little bit dry and tacky. So why is this called a 5-lever lock? Well, if we take the key that goes with your 5-lever mortise lock, you'll see a series of cutouts. You typically have 2 protrusions, one here and one here, and we're looking at everything in between. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sort of cutout shapes, and those 5 shapes correspond with 5 what appears to be brass plates in here, or 5 levers. So when your key comes into the lock like this and turns, you can see that the 5 levers marry up to the 5 indentations in the key, and as the key turns, it lifts those levers various heights. The key turns and those levers pivot around this point, and in each lever there's a notch at different positions. Okay, so as the key turns, it lifts these plates up, and if the key fits, it will line up these notches, these cutouts in the levers here, to correspond with this lug here on this stainless steel metal plate. Once those notches are lined up, that metal plate, which is pivoted down here, can turn this way with that bar bit going into the cutouts, which allows the rest of the mechanism to work and allows the main bit of the lock to move in and out. So here in this state, which is effectively the lock state, the lock is out, all the levers are down, none of the notches, the cutouts in the levers are married up. So I'm just going to put this back over just to hold everything in place. Put the key in, well, we'll unlock it, and that metal bar on the steel plate that I was referring to earlier now sits in all of the cutouts, in all of the levers there. You can see the levers are all moved to varying degrees, but the cutouts are all lined up, and that allowed the lock mechanism to unlock. So what can we do? Well, I could carefully take this apart, clean it all up, re-grease all the moving parts, put it back together again and see whether it gives it any easier movement. Now, I would stress that taking this apart, you must ensure you put these levers back in the right position. What I would suggest to you is, before you remove each one, you mark on there a number. So I will mark this one number 1, take it out, the next one number 2, and so on, so that they go back in the corresponding position. Also, you need to dismantle it when it's in the locked position, so that everything is in its unsprung condition, because as you can see at the moment, with the lock unlocked, these leaf springs here are under pressure, so it would be much easier to disassemble with those not under tension like that. So put the plate back on, lock it, and as you can see, those springs are under much less tension now. So using a pen, I'm going to mark that number 1, and then I'm going to lift it out. Number 2, lift that one out. Number 3, lift it out. Number 4, and number 5. Okay, that gives us a bit more access. We now have this body here, which was down in there. That has a nib on the bottom that locates itself into this spring. This spring can be lifted out. Like so. Just need to give that a clean up. Now there is a spring here that has the short lever pressing against this black plastic body, and a longer section with a downward piece that locates into this steel plate. So that spring is out. This can be lifted out. There's quite a bit of dirt under there, you see. And ultimately, what happens is this bar here gets moved across and it pulls the lock back. When the key is turned back the other way, that bar is allowed to move back, and the spring mechanism pushes the lock back into position. Now with everything removed, we can push the lock back and lift it up sort of diagonally, and it will come free. And there you can see that the back of this plate slides on the back body of the housing, and this little protrusion here slides in this recess. So these are areas to clean and grease. Now that's out of there, we can give this a bit of a polish up with some wet and dry. And finally, this lever can be lifted out of here like so and cleaned. We can now give that body a complete clean out. Okay, you maybe just heard this little piece fell out, and what this is the sliding lock bit, which sits in there like that. The back of it is recessed out, and this little, what should we call that, like little steel mushroom bit sits in there like that, enables the unit to slide, and that little head there of that mushroom just slides across the back plate. It probably just gives it a bit of stability during its sliding motion. So be sure to keep an eye out for one of these and make sure it's back in its home on the back of the sort of brass coloured locking bit. Right then, so let's clear all the dirt out of there. There we go, there's all the debris out, and then we can give that a good old wipe down and degrease and apply some new grease in there. I'm just putting the bits in a little tray. Just going to pour some white spirit in there. Get a toothbrush. Okay, so there are all the parts cleaned up. The lock element, I've given that a little bit of a sanding, and as you can see, all of the oxidization and debris that stuck to that over the years is now cleaned off, so it's nice and smooth. Now it's just a case of putting it back together. Okay, so let's get this back together. I shall be using some lithium grease on the various different pivot points. In my experience, it's best not to load too much grease onto these flat plates. Whilst it seems intuitive to do it, grease on there can actually cause a binding motion that overpowers this little spring mechanism. So I would only grease the pivot points. So first thing to go back in is actually the latch bit. So on here we need to apply a bit of grease to the nib that rides in the recess in there, and not forgetting to put in that little mushroom on the back of the latch and a little bit of grease on top of the head of that. And then we can just drop that back into its position in the body like so, and as you can see that slides back and forth like that. Next thing to go in is the bar that goes here. So there's a pivot point here and it's this plate here. So we'll put some grease in the pivot point there and some grease on the nib, but not really any grease on the back plate as it will bind to the house of the body of the lock. So let's drop that back on like so. Okay, so it can move freely. Then we need a plate that goes across here, which is this plate here. So we'll put some grease in its pivot point, and that goes over there like so, and it drops down. So that plate, the one we just put on, interacts with the first plate we put in. Okay, and that acts as a deadlock. As you can see, with it's in its down position, this latch cannot move in and out. When it's in its up position, that latch can slide. So that's effectively the deadlocking mechanism. And that is controlled by this vertical bar here that is controlled by the key. So by turning the key, we move this bar here, which moves this bar, which determines whether this latch is locked. Okay, next to go back in is this plastic piece here, and it just literally drops over these two lugs like so. And then importantly, this little spring. This spring is important because it drops that locking plate back out of the way when it's appropriate for it to do so. And I'm finding that putting too much grease in here between the plates causes binding, which overpowers this spring. Hence the go easy on the grease. So we drop it on like so. There's a short element to the spring that pushes against the black plastic here, leaving the longer part of the spring to be hooked around and to drop into the hole on the plate below. There we go. Is it going in the hole? There it goes, into the hole. So now that plate is sprung, and the spring has sufficient power to bring it back into its default position. Okay, so when it's in its default position, the latch cannot slide. When it's in its up position, the latch can move. Right, now then we need to drop back in this sort of cam part. So your key here, this is a cam. As it turns, it pushes the latch lock out of place, and secondly, it moves the latch. So a tiny little bit of grease around that part of this cam. Don't want too much, otherwise the excess will go onto your key every time you put it in and out the lock. Okay, and we just drop that down into place like so. As you can see, there's a nib there, which is like the cam. It rotates round, interacts with the lock plate, lifts that out of the way, and then ultimately slides the latch. Okay, the next thing to go in is this little spring mechanism here. This creates the resistance on the cam here, and also has an extended bar there, which I believe these 5 levers sit against. So we just need to put a little bit of grease on the back side of the spring plate there for where it interacts with the cam, and it goes in over these 2 pivot points or lugs, like so. Okay. Now it's a case of putting your levers back on. Now remembering, as I stressed before, they have to go back in the right order. Now we took them off, numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with 5 being the last one to come off, so that makes it the first to go back on. So there's number 5. Offer it down, gently bring the spring down into place, and just make sure it's fully home, like so. Now number 4. Number 3. Number 2. Yes, my spring has broken off number 2, but it still seems to operate. And then finally number 1. Okay, so that's all back together like so. Now we take the plate, offer it back on, hold it together, put the key in, and hey presto, it all turns rather nicely. Finally, just put your screws back in. So here we are back at the door. Let's get that lock back in there. So here we are back at the door. The lock's back in the mechanism. We put the key in and it turns super easy now. Much better than it was. So there you go guys, there's your 5-lever Mortice lock service. As I said earlier, and I stress, when you're taking those 5 levers out, you must ensure that you put them back in the right order. So I strongly recommend that you make a note with a pen on the plates, number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or A, B, C, D, whatever you want to do, but please make sure that you do make a note of the order that they come off. If you put them back in the wrong order, your lock will not work again. So there you go. Be lucky with that. My lock's working nicely. Hope you have some luck with yours. Please be sure to check out some of my other videos, and as ever, please give me a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. See you again very soon.